August 16th, 1944. Just outside the village of Nancy, France. The air is thick with the taste of ash and spent cordite. Hauptmann Karl Werner picks his way through a landscape of shattered trees and churned earth. The ground, still warm from yesterday's artillery barrage, groans under his boots. His uniform is coated in a fine, pale dust, making him look like a ghost moving through the ruins of the world. To his left, a smoldering Panther tank, its long 75mm gun drooping towards the dirt, a dead crewman half hanging from the commander's cupola. The metallic stench of cooked armor and something else, something sweet and foul, hangs in the humid air. But Werner's eyes are locked ahead, on a different shape, a hulk of olive drab, angled awkwardly in a crater, an American M4 Sherman. His men, a handful of weary, soot-streaked panzer grenadiers, have already secured the perimeter. They move with the slow, deliberate exhaustion of men who have been fighting for weeks without end. One of them, a boy no older than 19, gives a curt nod. It's clear, Herr Hauptmann. The crew, they did not make it. Werner approaches. You can almost feel the heat still radiating from the steel, see the shimmer in the air above the engine deck. The tank isn't just knocked out, it's been murdered. A single, brutal hole punched clean through the differential housing at the front. A kill shot from a high-velocity German round. The escape hatches are swung open, a desperate final bid for life that clearly failed. The evidence is there, in the dark, rust-colored stains on the interior walls. He runs a gloved hand over the Sherman's hull. The steel is rough, unfinished, not the meticulously machined and interlocking plates of a German panzer. This is different. This feels hasty. He traces a seam running vertically up the side of the hull, a long, continuous weld. His fingers follow its path from the bottom to the top. It's not a perfect weld. You can feel the ripples and ridges under your fingertips, but it is incredibly long, and it was made incredibly fast. A single, unbroken bead of molten steel laid down by a machine or a man working at a speed a German factory could never comprehend. He moves to the front, examining the cast, rounded hull. It's not welded here at all, but a single, massive piece of poured steel. Standardized. Simple. He knocks on it with his knuckles, the sound a dull, hollow thud. This isn't the tomb of a knight. This is the corpse of a mass-produced titan. And as he stands there, in the deafening quiet of the battlefield, a cold, creeping dread begins to wrap itself around his heart, a dread far colder than any fear of an incoming shell. This Sherman wasn't a masterpiece. It was a receipt, and the bill, he now realizes with a sickening certainty, was going to be paid in thousands more just like it. The dread crystallized into a cold, hard certainty in the pit of his stomach. Hauptmann Werner was no factory manager. He was a career soldier, an officer who understood the practicalities of war. But in that moment, staring at the Sherman's uncomplicated carcass, he became an unwilling accountant, and the numbers he was tallying were terrifying. He crouched by the front road wheel. Instead of the complex, interleaved design of a German tank, a maintenance nightmare that took hours to repair, he saw a simple, solid disc of steel. He peered at the bogie assemblies, standardized, identical units. A damaged one could be unbolted and replaced in an hour, maybe less. In Russia, he'd seen Tigers rendered immobile for days, waiting for a custom-fabricated suspension component. This American machine was built for repair, not reverence. His mind, against his will, began the grim algebra. He pictured the factory that birthed this thing. Not a cathedral of engineering like Krupp, where master craftsmen hand-fitted each plate. No, he imagined a vast, deafening hall, an endless conveyor line, pre-cut steel plates, hundreds of them, stacked like sheets of paper. A battery of welding torches held not by artisans, but by workers performing a single, repetitive motion. Sizzle, hiss. Sizzle, hiss. A hull takes shape in minutes, not days. The weld seam he had traced was the key. That long, continuous, slightly ugly bead was a signature. It spoke of speed over perfection. It was the antithesis of the German philosophy, where every tiger was a bespoke masterpiece, a rolling fortress of unparalleled individual strength. This Sherman was not a fortress. It was a unit, a cog. A memory flashed unbidden. The report from the Eastern Front on the Soviet T-34, crude, simple, and they came in waves that never seemed to end. This was that same industrial logic, but refined, perfected on a scale he could barely conceive. The United States hadn't just built a tank. They had built a process that could drown perfection in a tide of mere adequacy. His sergeant approached, offering a canteen. "Just a Tommy cooker, Herr Hauptmann. One less to worry about." Werner took the canteen but didn't drink. He looked from the dead Sherman to his own magnificent immobilized Panther to the exhausted faces of his men. They were trading their limited, irreplaceable kings for a handful of the enemy's limitless pawns. And the enemy had more pawns than they had squares on the board. He stood up abruptly, the canteen falling forgotten to the dirt. "Get me paper and a carbon set," he barked, his voice sharper than he intended. He had to document this. He had to make them understand in Berlin. This wasn't a battlefield assessment. It was an obituary for the entire German war machine, written in the stark, simple lines of an American tank. The command post was a world away from the visceral reality of the crater outside. It was a tomb of its own, buried deep in the cellar of a shattered Norman farmhouse, the air stale with the smell of damp earth, cigarette smoke, and low-grade fear. The only light came from a single sputtering petrol lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that made the maps on the rough wooden table seem alive with malevolent movement. Hauptmann Werner stood at attention, the grime of the battlefield still etched into the lines of his face. Before him, leaning over the situation map, was Oberst von Fulkersam. The colonel was a relic of a different war, his impeccably tailored uniform a stark contrast to the filth-smeared fatigue Werner wore. A monocle was clamped in his eye, and his expression was one of profound, weary annoyance. "A report, Hauptmann," von Fulkersam said, not looking up from the map where small black countermarkers were being systematically surrounded by a tide of red. "We are coordinating a fighting withdrawal across a 12-kilometer front, and you wish to file a report on a single destroyed enemy tank?" Werner placed the carbon-smudged pages on the table. The top sheet was a detailed sketch of the Sherman's hull weld, with precise notes on the suspension and casting. "It is not about the tank itself, Herr Oberst. It is about what it represents, its construction. It is a revelation. They are not building machines, they are stamping them out. The speed, the standardization." Von Fulkersam finally looked up, the monocle glinting in the lamplight. He picked up the report as if it was something unclean. His eyes scanned the first page, then flicked back to Werner. "You spent 2 hours on this. We destroyed the tank, did we not? A single shot from a Panzergrenadier unit. This confirms the qualitative inferiority of the American material. Their steel is softer, their guns are weaker. A Panther can destroy 5, 10 of these from a distance they cannot even hope to engage from. With all respect, Herr Oberst, Werner's voice was tight. "That is precisely the trap. They do not need to engage our panthers one-to-one. They need only to be there. For every panther we have, they will have 10, 20 Shermans. For every round we fire, they will have 100. This," he gestured to the report, "this weld seam is their real weapon, not the 75mm gun." The colonel dropped the papers back onto the table. They landed with a soft, dismissive slap. "This is industrial fantasy, Werner. Defeatist talk. Our focus is tactics, terrain, the fighting spirit of the German soldier. We have faced material superiority before. The Russian steppes are littered with the burned-out hulks of their crude tanks, proof that will and weaponry triumph over mere quantity." He turned back to his map, moving a black counter a few centimeters to the east, a retreat. "Your duty, Hauptmann, is to hold your section of the line, not to lecture the armaments ministry on production techniques through unofficial channels. The Führer's wonder weapons will soon decide this war. Not weld seams." The dismissal was absolute, a door slamming shut in Werner's face. He stood there for a moment longer, the truth he had held in his hands out in the sunlight, now rendered meaningless in this underground tomb. He had brought them a glimpse of the avalanche coming their way, and they had called it a snowball. He retrieved his report. The carbon copies were smudged, imperfect, just like the truth they contained. A truth that was now his own to carry, as the deep, rhythmic thrum of Allied artillery began to walk closer, a sound that was, itself, as standardized and relentless as the production lines that fed it. The order was given, not with a shouted command, but with a weary, almost imperceptible nod from Oberst von Volkersam. The retreat had begun. Hauptmann Werner led his decimated company east, away from the crushing pressure of the Falaise pocket. They moved like ghosts through the smoke, a ragged column of men whose eyes had seen too much. The once proud Panzer Grenadiers were now just exhausted figures, their uniforms in tatters, their weapons held more out of habit than hope. They stumbled past the husks of armored vehicles, a gutted half-track, the skeletal frame of a personnel carrier, another Panther, its track blown off, abandoned to the advancing tide. And then they crested a small wooded ridge overlooking a road leading to the front. Werner froze. The column of men behind him staggered to a halt. No one spoke. The only sound was the labored breathing of the soldiers and the ever-present distant thunder of the guns. Below them, snaking along the road as far as the eye could see in both directions, was a river of olive drab. Not a column, not a battalion, an army. A seemingly endless procession of M4 Sherman tanks, 2.5 trucks, and armored personnel carriers. They moved with a relentless mechanical purpose, their dusty, identical forms blending into a single flowing entity. The low grumble of 1,000 engines was a vibration felt in the bones, a deep choral hum that dwarfed the sporadic individual reports of German artillery. Sizzle, hiss, sizzle, hiss. The sound of the welder from his mind was now the sound of 1,000 tank tracks clattering over cobblestones. Werner's hand tightened on the stock of his rifle. His report, the one von Volkersam had dismissed as fantasy, was no longer a document. It was a prophecy unfolding in real time on the road below. He saw it all now, not as an abstract concept, but as a physical, crushing reality. The standardized parts, the rapid assembly seams, this was the product, this was the harvest of those unimaginable factories across the ocean. A young lieutenant next to him, his face pale and smudged with dirt, whispered, "Mein Gott, there are so many of them." Werner didn't answer. He just watched. He counted 10, 20, 50 Shermans roll past in the space of a minute, and the end of the column was nowhere in sight. Each one was a perfect duplicate of the corpse he had inspected hours before. Each one was a monument to the industrial logic he had tried and failed to explain. They weren't just facing an army, they were facing an entire economic system, weaponized and set in motion. He thought of the single perfect kill shot on the Sherman near Nessie, a triumph of German engineering, a masterpiece of gunnery, and for what? To be erased from the earth by this flood of mediocrity? The arithmetic was complete, and the sum was despair. He had held a single grain of sand and tried to warn them of the desert. And now the dunes were moving, and they were about to be buried. August 21st, 1944. A makeshift POW cage near Trun. The world had been reduced to mud, the smell of unwashed men, and the hollow ache of surrender. Hauptmann Karl Werner sat with his back against a splintered fence post, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the barbed wire. The proud panzer officer's uniform was now just a set of filthy rags. Around him, the remnants of the Wehrmacht's once invincible army sat in a stunned silence, broken only by the occasional cough or the distant, happy shouts of American GIs, their voices full of a future Werner's men had lost. His mind kept replaying the final moments, not the surrender, but the sight from that ridge, the river of olive drab, the sound. It had been the sound of the end. A low rumble began to build, a familiar vibration through the earth. The German prisoners stirred, their heads turning like a single organism. Down the road, adjacent to the cage, a new column was rolling forward to the front. Shermans. Dozens of them. They were fresh from the depot, their olive drab paint still relatively clean, their tracks slapping rhythmically against the pavement. Werner watched them, no longer with dread, but with a detached clinical exhaustion. He was an archaeologist of his own defeat, studying the artifact that had sealed his fate. He focused on one tank in particular, rumbling past only 50 meters away. His eyes, trained by his epiphany at Nessie, automatically traced its lines. There it was, the long, continuous vertical weld on the hull, exactly the same. He saw the identical bogey assemblies, the same cast front glossy. It was a perfect duplicate, a carbon copy. A single page from an infinite identical printing press. A young American tank commander, perched in the cupola, caught Werner's eye. He couldn't have been older than 20. He gave a casual, almost apologetic wave to the cage of defeated veterans before turning back to face the road ahead, a boy off to finish a job. And in that moment, the final crushing weight of the truth settled upon Werner. It wasn't about better soldiers or better tactics. It wasn't even about better tanks. It was about that boy in that cupola and the thousands more just like him, backed by a system that could replace him, his tank, and everything in it without a second thought. Germany had bet everything on producing a handful of unstoppable giants. The Allies had simply paved the road with a million ordinary stones. He looked around the cage at the faces of his men, the grizzled sergeants, the fanatical lieutenants, the terrified boys. They had all believed in the wonder weapons, the superior will, the destiny of the Reich. They had fought with a courage that deserved a better cause. Werner closed his eyes. He had held the truth in his hands, a truth written in the rough weld seams of a single broken tank. He had tried to deliver it, but Berlin had not wanted to hear it. Now the truth was no longer his to carry. It was self-evident. It was rolling past him on the road, in a column that stretched all the way back to the sea, and all the way forward into a future Germany had been deemed unworthy to have.